Prayer, if you would. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this beautiful day that you've given us the opportunity to enjoy. We're thankful at this time for the privilege and desires to assemble together in thy name, that we might spend our time in studying thy word together. We pray that you'd help us to focus on the things that are before us from your inspired word as we seek to apply the things that we do learn to our lives. And we pray that you'd be with each one that is assembled here this evening, with each family that is represented, that you'd bless the teachers as they direct the classes, and that everything that we do might be in full harmony with thy divine will. It's in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen. All right, we've made our way down in our questions to the beginning of chapter number 8. Chapter number 8. And in the questions, of course, there's a title that's given. Of course, these titles are human titles, obviously, just like the statements that you might see at the top of the Bible. That's not inspired. That's something that's been provided by man to give you a sort of an idea as to what man determines or thinks the section is all about. Well, the same thing is true here, and of course it pretty well hits the nail on the head as well relative to authority. People are in position of power, and how are you supposed to respond to that? How do you respond to authority? And when you talk about the matter of authority, that's probably one of the reasons why there's such a divided religious world, is because of all the different standards of authority that men have elevated to be the authority by which they're going to conduct their lives. And of course, that can be a tremendous problem when you're not submitting to the same authority. Then you're going to end up with different ideas. Imagine people in the United States of America trying to follow the rules and regulations of a foreign country. Well, that wouldn't work, would it? Oh, well, and of course, there wouldn't be no reason for it to work because we're not living in a foreign country. Or imagine, if you would, somebody coming to the United States of America and saying, well, we don't do this where I come from. Well, you're not where you come from. You're in another country now. We have laws and procedures. If you're going to be in this country, you need to follow these laws and procedures. And when you don't, that's called violation of law, and there are consequences. We're going to see more about that even in this context as well. When people think that they can just flaunt or set aside whatever the laws are and the consequences, they don't think they have to face them. Well, that's not right as it relates to civil authority, and of course it's obviously not right as it relates to divine authority and religious authority. So we have to submit to authority. So what he's going to be talking about here in this little section, he is talking about the position of a wise man in view of the fact that sometimes when a person is in a position where he's dealing with those in authority, it just may be the case that those who are in the position of authority may not have the citizens' best interest at heart. Now, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're motivated by various things. And it's not always the case that those who are in positions of authority, and of course that would have application whether you're talking about the government, or you're talking about the family, or whether you're talking about a congregation of God's people. Just because there's people in a position of authority does not necessarily mean that their desires are going to be in harmony with what God wants established in the home and school and in society in general. And so and Solomon, in his estrangement from God, recognizes that to be the case, and so he's going to be dealing with and saying some specific things relative to what we're supposed to do in light of those things. It seems to be the case that when you face things as they are not and things that they should be, then it seems that there are two extremes that people will sometimes take. Sometimes a person realizing that there's injustices that are going on, that things are not being done right, then here's an individual who takes the extreme of just throwing himself at all that and is in constant chaos and confusion because he knows that the way things are supposed to be are not that way. And so he has a higher ideal of the way things should be, and he's constantly doing battle with the wrong that is going on, whether it's imagined or whether it's real. Now, that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is, don't worry about it. You can't do anything. it's all going to end the same way, whether you like it or not, so just go along to get along. And those are two extremes. And as is the case with a whole lot of stuff, those two extremes are both wrong. They're both wrong. There is a happy medium, and that happy medium is in accordance with the truth. You know, there's something that's been referred to as the Serenity Prayer. Have you ever heard that statement made? Of course, it goes along with Alcoholics Anonymous or other such organizations as that. But what the Serenity Prayer in essence says is exactly what Solomon is getting at right here. He says, Lord, give me the strength to right all the wrongs I can, the humility to accept the inevitable, and the wisdom, no difference. Now, it's maybe said in a little bit different ways as to what rendition of the Serenity Prayer that you're talking about, but there is wisdom speaking. Is there actually something that I can do that would contribute to the betterment of the situation? Or is this situation that is so flustering to me, is it so far afield that there ain't nothing I can do about it anyhow? And then having the wisdom to say, okay, this is in one of those two categories. Does what I think about it have any bearing on it at all? Will it change anything? Now, you can see how then, with that view, which is exactly what he's going to be talking about in specific detail here in this particular chapter, you can see how that what's necessary to figure out what you ought to do demands a little bit of mental exercise. You have to actually exercise your intellect to the degree that you can figure out between those two extremes, between those two matters. Will this have any bearing on anything? If it will have no bearing whatsoever on any situation or anybody involved in it, then it would be absolutely foolish for me to waste sleep thinking about it. For sure. But could that likely be an easy out for someone who views things that way when in reality there is something they can do? And maybe it's a whole lot easier to say, well, ain't nothing going to do about it anyhow, so I'm not going to think about it. Well, will that absolve you? Or is it possible that if you looked at the situation a little bit deeper, then you could realize that, no, here is something you can do. You know, I heard a few years ago a fellow make this observation. He's a smart guy, well-respected preacher in the brotherhood, you know, and he says, we need to quit worrying about writing letters to senators and representatives and do more praying. Well, my response to that was, well, why not both? Why not both? Why has this got to be an either-or situation? You see? And, of course, I think that's the correct view of it. Because praying, if I'm not willing to do what I can do to address an issue, then what am I doing praying for? If I'm not doing what I have the capacity to do to try to remedy a situation, whether it be big or small, then is God really going to pay any attention to me when I pray for something to be changed or fixed or in some way different, if I'm not willing to exercise the effort on my part to see to it that it happens that way anyhow? Well, sure. Some have been said we sometimes need to put feet on our prayers. In other words, once we've done all that we can do, then we turn it over to God. But don't just turn it over to God without doing what you can do. Because you're missing a step there, see? There is something that we can do. Now, there are some things that you can't do anything about. But what Solomon is saying here is to be able to distinguish between the things that you can do to remedy the situation and the things that it's fruitless to do anything about to remedy the situation. You know, at some point in time, I mean, just think of Bible examples. Did not Jesus tell the apostles, when you go into a city and people are nice to you, then make your lodging with them. But if you go into a city and you start preaching the gospel and people are trying to kill you and telling you to shut up, then keep on beating your head against the wall? No. Dust your sandals off and go somewhere else. I mean, the very instruction in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, don't cast your pearls before swine or give that which is holy to the dogs, means that you have to make a discernment there. You have to make a judgment as to who the hogs and the dogs are. And you're required to. So if you make a determination that this is in fact someone who, at this point in time at least, from your examination of the situation, the way they're responding to what's going on, that they are not looking at what you're trying to present to them as the holy thing that it is, and that's maybe the way it's been for the last 2 months in your conversation, then maybe, just maybe, you might all just let that alone. Maybe not permanently, but leave that alone for a while and go talk to somebody else. Because you're wasting time, it seems, at the present. Don't give that which is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine. You know, I think John Nan put it in the bulletin one time. There's a little cartoon, and here's this pig sitting there, and he's sitting on his rear end, you know, and he's looking up like that, and he's talking, and he says, I don't know why, but I'm sitting here, and people just keep on coming up and casting pearls in front of me. I mean, there's a pile of pearls about as tall as the pig is, you know. So I think that's a pretty good, somebody needs to make it an emoji out of that or something, you know. Don't cast your pearls. And of course, the illustration of that particular cartoon was, if somebody is told not to do something, I guarantee you some people are going to do it spite, you know. Said, don't you tell me I can't cast my pearls before swine. And here's all this pile of pearls before this hog. So it really shouldn't surprise us. To accept the inevitable means of necessity that you have made the determination that the inevitable is the inevitable. Now, how did you get to that conclusion? Did you hear it on a news show? Did you read it in the paper? Did somebody tell you that? Did you swallow it as if it was the truth without investigation? So that's a personal responsibility that all of us have. If you're going to determine that something is inevitable, then how did you draw that conclusion? I mean, you know, the whole thing about Christianity is, and it's oftentimes overlooked and sometimes made fun of, is that genuine Christianity demands the use of the mind. And if there is a religion being practiced that does not demand the use of the mind, you know for sure it ain't Christianity. Not the New Testament model, which is the only one that matters. You have to use your mind. You have to love God with your mind. You have to think in accordance with truth. Judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. You know, make a determination based upon facts. And when you make determination based upon facts, then you know it's in accordance with the truth. And we just wish that was the case with a whole lot of people. So what he's going to be doing here in this particular little section here, all the way through at least verse number 9, he's going to be talking about the need to submit to people who are in authority. And while generally speaking, I think here he's talking about kings and other such people who would be in that position, then the principle would apply to any situation in which you are supposed to submit to authority. And obviously, at what point in your life do you realize, do you finally come to the conclusion that just because an individual's in a position of authority does not mean that they're perfect and they always make right decisions? You know, that can be a very startling awareness when a young person finds out that their parents ain't perfect, you know. And of course, I don't know any decent parents who have ever claimed that they were, you know. And realizing that they're learning right along with the young'uns they're seeking to raise because they ain't never been there, they ain't never done that before. So that's that. All right, number one. What is another benefit of wisdom. And in verse number 1 here. Here's a wise man, and why is he a wise man? He knows something. He knows something. He's come to a conclusion based upon something, even to the extent that it says he knows the interpretation of a thing. Now, yeah, absolutely. The wise man has the ability to draw proper conclusions. And when he draws those proper conclusions through his wisdom by examining the evidence and drawing the conclusion that's made necessary by that, then he's going to be satisfied. He's got a picture here in the last part of this verse. We'll notice here in verse 1, who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. Now that's sort of a shining face, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. What's the idea there? Have you ever seen a situation, and of course they show it in cartoons all the time, you know. Here's an individual who's puzzled, and can you figure it out? And then when they figure it out, all of a sudden, you know, their whole demeanor changes. Do what? They're confident now. They've figured it out. They know what's going on here. And so there's as a matter of fact, I found a couple of translations that are a little bit different in the expression of the same thing. But listen to one here. Who is like the wise man that knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illuminates him and causes his face to beam. What is my alarm clock going off for? Who did that? Man. If that don't beat all. Well, now I know that your alarm will go off even when it's turned off on the side. Had no idea. That's another reason to completely turn your silly phone off, I guess. So a man's wisdom illuminates him and causes his stern face to beam. Now that's a little bit worded more so as to maybe being able to grasp it. And then here's a paraphrase that says the same thing in a few different words. How wonderful to be wise, to understand things, to be able to analyze them and interpret them. Wisdom lights up a man's face and softens its hardness. And so here's this fellow that's, you know, he's stern and hard and confused, and then all of a sudden he figures it out, you know. I don't know if it's old wives' tale or what, you know, but they used to say it took a whole lot more energy to frown than it did to smile, you know. And when you frown, then your face, that's what caused so many wrinkles. Who knows whether that's true or not, but as much money is spent on trying to remove wrinkles in our day and age, then maybe just a little smiling along the way would have helped instead of frowning. Who knows? Who knows? And then there's a phrase here as well, regarding the oath of God here in verse number 2, and there's not a question with verse number 2, so let's look at that for a minute. He says, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. Well, what in the world is that talking? Well, obviously he's talking about in the first part of the verse, he's talking about obeying the people who are in position of authority. Well, that's not anything new. Of course, we know that Paul, over in Romans chapter 13, says exactly the same thing. Obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves. He even refers to civil government as being a minister of God to thee for good, if you do good. Now, sometimes it gets sort of backwards and upside down and inside out and everything else, sadly. But that's not God's design for our civil government, to punish the good and reward the evil. And so when that actually happens, then you've got a real problem on your hands. So So this oath of God, as is described here, could very well be, say you got a man who is ascending to the throne. And of course, I'm calling to mind situations in more or less in the Middle Ages and stuff, which would be similar to in ancient time, like in the days of Saul and David and Solomon and other countries who had kings like that, where they're anointed king before all this crowd of people, and then everybody basically swears their allegiance to the new leader, you know. And so what he's saying then, in essence, if that's the case, then he's saying, okay, when this person rose to the position of being king, we all swore our allegiance to him. We promised to be faithful to him, and so we obey him because he's the king and we're supposed to obey the king. That, to me, that simply makes sense. And if that's not the case, then I ain't got a clue what it means, just to tell you the truth. All right, number two, why are we to obey the king's commandment?
Well, by doing that, we're obeying God.
Well, that's it. That's it. You know, it's like, and this is something that has application outside of civil authority. I mean, it has application in the home, has application on the job, has application everywhere, in that ultimately the reason why you're submitting to the person that you're submitting to is because God said so, you know. And so when Paul would use words in Titus chapter 2 to describe what a responsibility is of a slave to his master, and of course then obviously the master is a slave too, but the slave is not supposed to obey his master just so he won't take a whooping, but he's to obey his master because he's a Christian. You know, he's going to be the very best slave, and of course you can take the principle there and apply it to the employer-employee relationship. You don't obey your employer just because you don't want to get in trouble. You obey him because you're a Christian and you're obeying God first, and it just so happens that here's an individual that is over you that you're supposed to obey. Same thing holds true in the home. You know, is it the case sometimes that a wife doesn't necessarily want to do what her husband wants her to do? Well, that, I know it hardly ever happens. Joke, you know. But the reason why she does what he desires for her to do, if it's not in opposition to the will of God, is because God tells her to. You know, and of course, if the husband's what he's supposed to be, then she's thankful for him and to be able to do that. But regardless, if you've got a tyrant for a boss, does that give you the justification to not pay attention to what he says, to take advantage of him, to not give a good day's work for a day's pay? No. You still have an obligation even if it's a tyrant. Same thing with a husband-wife relationship. If your husband's a tyrant, you still have an obligation to him. If the government is filled with crooks, you still have an obligation to the government. And if you didn't, then things would be a whole lot worse than they are presently. So, because ultimately our obligation is to God. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Somebody says, well, yeah, but the Lord was perfect. Well, that's right, for sure. But even though the Lord was perfect, do those who are married to Christ, do they always act in accordance with the will of their husband? No. Why not? He's perfect. Hadn't thought about that, have we? But that principle holds true there as well. So, obeying those that are in the position of authority because it's the right thing to do. Even when, I mean, we went out there, me and Sue went out to Bethlehem last night. And, of course, up there on the mountain where the speed limit ought to be at least 100. I mean, you can see for miles. And we did see a buck, too. So I was glad that I wasn't going over the speed limit because it might have been on that buck and hit it and tore my Tammy's car up. But if we had our druthers, then we probably would not have some of the speed limits, especially on some of these roads where it goes from 65 to 55 to 25 in a half a mile, you know. But that's the law of the land. And we obey the laws of the land, not because we necessarily love those laws, but because God tells us to. And if we just acted any way we wanted to, then there'd be a whole lot more accidents than there are. The only one that's avoiding accidents, it seems, is those that are simply trying to follow the will of God and do what the government says to do. All right, number 3, what will obedience to the king usually bring? Usually.
Well, the king's powerful, and so you can avoid harm by obeying.
Exactly. I mean, since the king is the king and he's in the powerful position that he is, then you cannot, without thought, do those things that might be frowned upon by the person that's in a position where he can take your head off if he wants to. Makes sense, don't it? Sure it does. And so when he says here, back up here in verse 3, about being hasty, don't be hasty to go out of his sight. Now, evidently the idea here is, you know, in the face of a tyrant leader, a tyrant king, then if something is said that is completely off the wall, don't make any sense at all, then you don't in a huff turn around, I'm not sitting here listening to that. That may be the last thing you ever say. Because he has the power of your life and your death in his hands. So you don't rashly act like that. You don't, and of course he goes through here and he explains some other things as well. That doesn't mean that you just go along forever and don't even try to put your 2 cents in, but you've got to think that there's maybe a right way and a right place and a right things to say at the right time. You don't just necessarily say it right then, not to any authority. You know, I told you about when we was moving back down here to Dunlap and up there on the mountain where the speed limit ought to be 100 miles an hour, and I had a car that it was 10 miles off, and I never could remember whether it was 10 miles per hour off to low or high. I never could remember. Well, guess what? It was low. And so I was traveling along there, and I had the car packed full of stuff, moving and everything, and Jared was with me. And all of a sudden, Jared said, "Daddy, he got you." And I said, "What? Who got me?" And I looked, rear view mirrors, and there's state trooper. Well, that old fella, I knew a whole bunch of people in his family. R.C. Christian, who was also a trooper, sang at this guy's wedding. I found that out. He knew Mike Walker, of course. He knew all these people I knew. And then he still said, "Well, Miss Clayton, I hate to meet you under these circumstances, but here's you a bill for $75 for breaking the speed limit." Now, what if I'd have said, "Listen, Mr. Mosley," that was his name. His last name was Mosley. I said, "Won't you go back out there to Spencer and bother somebody that's really a criminal and leave us law-abiding citizens alone?" Well, I might still be under the jail out there at Spencer today. I didn't do that, see? Did I appreciate it that I got my first speeding ticket? No, I didn't appreciate it, but I paid it because I was guilty, you know? And I could have thought all those things, but to have expressed those things that I thought at the time would have been foolish indeed, because he had the power to leave Jerry there on the side of the road who didn't have a driver's license as of yet, and here I am going to jail. That would have been dumb, wouldn't it? Well, sure it would have. So when a person's in a position of authority like that, you have to be careful and not say or do those things, even if the things that you're trying to get done or want them to hear is going to end up being wonderful in your eyes later on. It may not be perceived as that at the present. So don't be surprised if the FBI don't show up at your house. Next question, number 4. How much power do we have in the day of death? Quotation mark. We don't have none, really. Now, somebody say, well, you can kill yourself quickly, you know. But here, I think actually the point that he's making here is relative not just to that general thing, although that is generally true, but he's talking about a person who's in a position of authority, like a king, who is a tyrant, and he's taking advantage of his position and making it hard on his subjects. He can do all that. He has the power to do all that. He has the power to be as mean as he wants to be, to enact laws, as whatever he wants to do, he can do that. But he don't have the power to keep himself from dying. I mean, he can live to be 969 years old if he lives back during the time of Adam and Noah and Enoch and Methuselah and all. But he still is not going to extend his life past when he dies. Can't do it. You can't buy off death. So there's a point in time, even when a person who has been placed in a position of power like that will realize just how powerless he is in the face of death. Now, of course, that goes for everybody, but as the context here, it seems to be a warning to the person who is an oppressive ruler, that he needs to realize that as well. Okay, let's begin reading at verse 10. If somebody has that handy, read verse 10 through 17, if you would. All right, so he ends up in discussing to a degree providence and trying to figure out everything and why everything works the way it does and why God does what he does and all that, and that's outside of his comprehension and understanding. And of course, one thing from that gives us comfort is if the wisest man there ever was, other than the Lord, can draw such a conclusion as that, then we shouldn't feel so futile that we can't figure it all out either, because he could. Okay? Now, that doesn't remove from us the responsibility of seeking God's ways and doing them, but understanding the whys and the wherefores of things that happen, one of these days we'll understand it better. That sounds like maybe the words to a song, you know. Later on, we'll understand. But at the present, we say, just as David did, and just as Solomon is saying, why? Why do good people have it so bad? Why do bad people have it so good? Why? Why, if everything's the way it's supposed to be, then the people who were blessed and benefited physically and emotionally and materially, then those would be the people that were doing God's bidding, and those that were doing opposite of that, they'd be suffering. They wouldn't be able to do nothing. They couldn't get by through life. If I was God, that's what I'd do. Well, you ain't God. I ain't either. See? There's a lot of things that has to be seen in the midst of all, because what's this old saying? A smooth ocean a good sailor did not make, or something like that, you know. Of course, I'm not going to be doing no sailing anyway. I can't swim worth a flip. I could float fat probably all the way to New England or somewhere. But it's the challenges and the difficulties of life that allow us, that sometimes force us to grow up and become better instead of becoming bitter. So let's look at these questions that are associated with this particular section here. Well, before we go to the question, there's all a verse there that don't have even a question associated with it, and it's dealing with a sad situation. And I think the context is reference to, here's a king who's the king, and everybody knows he's the king. Everybody has to love the king, has to bow down to the wishes of the king, and yet it won't be long until that king's dead. Nobody even know who he was. I mean, there may be a building that is built in memory of this particular fella, but that building is prone to be destroyed later on too. What happens when the town gets bigger and they expand it and they have to tear it down for a parking lot? Then everybody forgets about this fella who was in a position of authority and power and made it hard on his subjects. And what was his name? Well, we don't know. Now, the sad thing is, in a general way, that's the way it is with all of us, you know. When you start, and of course some of the regrets that I've had is not asking people when they had their mind about things that happened before I was around. And you think about that after, there's nothing you can do about it. You know, I guess you could get on one of these ancestry.com things, you know, and start trying to find things out, you know. But you'd like to know about the people that lived before you. You'd like to know about your great-great-grandpappy and all these things that happened in the past. Now, that's an interesting thing for family, but is it for anybody else? Probably not. Probably not. Unless you got a whole bunch of time on your hands and don't have anything else to do, then that might be an exercise that somebody would engage themselves in. So ultimately then, since nobody is going to be left to even know or care about me, then that would seem to dictate that the God who created me and is concerned and does know my name, he should take priority in my life. Because ultimately it's to him that I am accountable, because he won't forget me. He won't not know my name for sure. And then, which bleeds into the next question, and I don't know whether it's a coincidence that this fits into the context of a tyrant ruler or not, but I can certainly see how it could for sure. And the question says, what happens when justice is delayed? That's right. When justice is delayed, it's almost as if justice doesn't happen. It just keeps on being pushed further and further and further and further. And of course, right now we have got terrible examples of no cash bail, where a person in some of these big cities can commit a crime up to and including attempted murder, and they're back on the street before the funeral's over for the person that they killed, and then they're able to commit another murder, and they get almost a pass on that too, and they're out on the street, and it just keeps on and on and on. And so you have people who finally are not brought to justice, and they have 10 felonies on their record, and then finally they do something so atrocious that they actually then are sentenced to prison. And what does that do for everybody that's observing all this going on in that community where this is all taking place? Well, somebody says, well, you know, it might be a little dangerous, but, you know, we won't have to worry about it for a while, because we're not going to go to jail until we actually have to stand before a judge. Now, we can roam the streets and commit further crimes and do all kind of stuff because justice is not being executed speedily. And then you have that happening generation after generation after generation. Then that's why, if you got any sense, you don't visit towns like that. Without a tank, I wouldn't. A tank and a bulletproof vest. I'd want an iron suit, I think, that's about 2 inches thick before I'd even go to some of these places where that's the norm. That's just the way it is. Now, here's the situation I talked about before. Now, is that something that you can't do anything about, and you just have to resolve that, well, this is something I'm not going to worry about, I'm not going to think about, because ain't nothing I can do about it? No, there's something we can do about it. There is something we can do about it. And when we've done all we can do about a matter, then we say, well, it's inevitable. But we can't say it's inevitable until we do what we can do. Then it's inevitable, and not before. Don't allow that to be an excuse for not doing what needs to be done, for sure.
I don't want to go everywhere else and fight a war. When we got plenty of wars in this country that need to be fought, and something needs to be done about it. And sometimes war's it's not pretty.
No, it's not.
It's not pretty. And when you got to do what needs to be done in this country, there's going to be a lot of people in trouble. There's going to be a lot of young people that's in jail. It's so big.
Absolutely.
We don't have enough of that.
Exactly. I mean, you cannot have a lawless society that lasts long, and that's what we've got, sadly now, in many parts of the country, is utter lawlessness. No law, no consequences for dastardly deeds, And when there's no consequences, then you are in fact asking for more of the same type of stuff because you're not punishing what should be punished. You're saying it don't matter, or it matters so little that we're not going to do anything about it. We don't want to hurt nobody's feelings.
It's so discouraging when you watch on the news, people go into a store, especially California, and just rake it into a basket, and people just stand there and watch them, and they walk right out the door, nothing, and they say to people if they did do something to them, they could go to jail.
Oh yeah, they're the ones that would get in trouble.
And it's so sad that we've gotten to that point.
Well, I'll tell you, right after Walmart moved in here, I was up there at Walmart one day, and I saw these 3 kids. They were back there in the belts and the billfold section. And they was taking those billfolds out of the boxes, and they were looking through them and seeing if there's something that would sound, I guess, and they were sticking them in their pocket and putting these 2 or 3 belts on under their shirts and all that. Well, I went up front and I said, hey, there's 3 guys that I just saw back there, and they're doing this. And she said, don't say anything to them. I said, well, are you going to say anything to them? She said, they told us not to. Now, see, the thing is about that, so it says, well, it's not any of my business. Well, they're making the belts and the pocketbooks and the billfolds that I buy more expensive. So it is my business. Oh. We should a long time ago nipped it in the bud. And if we had Marty Fife, we would have done that for sure. That's it. What? Yeah. Exactly. Oh, man. Where do we get to? Oh, number 2. What comfort can we find from Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 12? And of course, this is the same type of comfort that David received when he complained about this situation.
Says it'd be well with them that fear God.
All right? The person that flies in the face of God's will ultimately receive justice. May not be here, probably won't be here, but he'll ultimately receive justice. His day will come, his time will come, and then the consequences will be meted out. And that is comfort to the person that's not in the position of flaunting the authority of God to begin with. The person that does God's bidding, then he's not fearful of death and the consequences that come that way. Thank y'all so much. We'll begin right here, Lord willing, on Sunday morning.